Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, Middle East tensions may be ramping back up. Israeli military officials are saying they have no choice but to respond to Iran's drone and missile attack over the weekend. But the U.S. and European allies are urging Israel to avoid the kind of tit-for-tat that could spark a wider war. Here's State Department spokesman Matthew Miller.
Israel is a sovereign country. They have to make their own decisions about how best to defend themselves. What we always try to do is provide our best advice as a longtime friend of Israel and a longtime ally and partner of Israel. And that's what we've done since October 7th across a broad range of fronts. It's what we have done over the weekend.
Matthew Miller at the State Department says the Biden administration has put more than 500 sanctions on Iranian entities to hold Tehran accountable.
But for Israel, Nathan, the question isn't if the country responds, but how. More on that from Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson.
There's a wide range of possibilities here, from a direct attack, as you say, from Israel on Iran. That would not be unprecedented, but that's one option for them, targeting military sites, perhaps even nuclear sites in Iran. Of course, there's a lot of concern about Iran's nuclear program. Or does it go for something instead, like going for one of Iran's proxies in the region? We're talking about the Houthis in Yemen. We're talking about Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Do they go through one of those proxies to retaliate?
Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson reports the timing of an Israeli response also is not clear. Iran's deputy foreign minister is warning any Israeli counterattack would be met with a more severe, faster, and immediate blow. He says it would take seconds for his country to launch another strike.
Well, Karen, the turmoil in the Middle East has added new urgency to passing foreign aid in the House after months of inaction. Bloomberg's Ed Baxter reports votes could come this week.
Speaker Mike Johnson is planning separate votes this week on new aid to both Israel and Ukraine. This in an attempt to assemble fragile coalitions to speed weaponry to both places.
We have terrorists and tyrants and terrible leaders around the world like Putin and Xi and in Iran, and they're watching to see if America will stand up for its allies and in our own interest around the globe, and we will.
Now, his party majority is very slim, and he may need Democrat support, and he very well may get it. The impasse over aid has been dragging on since October. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Ed, thank you. Now to the historic criminal case involving former President Donald Trump. Jury selection continues today. Bloomberg law host June Grasso has the latest from New York.
Trump's criminal trial got off to a slow start. The jury selection process began hours late because of a slew of motions the trial judge had to handle first. And then more than half of the first pool of 96 prospective jurors was dismissed after saying they couldn't be fair and impartial. Court adjourned for the day with 0 jurors chosen, and the judge saying, "We're way behind schedule." Jury selection resumes this morning. June Grasso, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, June, thank you. And while Trump deals with those legal issues, President Biden's hitting the campaign trail in his childhood home state of Pennsylvania. The Biden campaign says the trip aims to highlight the differences between the president's tax and economic agenda and the policies of Trump, who oversaw tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. Biden's 3-day trip includes a visit to Scranton and events in the Pittsburgh area, where Nippon Steel's deal to buy United States Steel has rankled union allies. The president will close out the trip Thursday in Philadelphia.
Well, turning to Wall Street now, Nathan. First quarter earnings for the nation's biggest banks wrap up later this morning with Bank of America and Morgan Stanley. Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger has a look at what to expect.
For Bank of America, a key number to watch, net interest income, which alone is forecast to be about $14 billion, about 2% lower than a year ago. Consensus calls for total revenue of $25.43 billion and adjusted earnings per share of 77 cents. As for Morgan Stanley, a jump in investment banking activity may help offset an expected pullback in earnings for the 9th quarter in a row, although the pace of declines likely slowed. Consensus calls for revenue of $14.46 billion and adjusted earnings per share of $1.66. Jeff Bellinger, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Jeff, thank you. Well, after another strong reading on retail sales, another Fed official says there's no rush to cut interest rates. Here's San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly at an event at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research.
The worst thing we can do right now is act urgently when urgency isn't necessary. The policy's in a good place. We're in the ready position. We can respond as the economy evolves. The labor market's not giving us any indication it's faltering, and inflation is still above our target, and we need to be confident it is on path to come down to our target before we would feel the need, and I would feel the need to react.
San Francisco Fed Chief Mary Daly votes on monetary policy this year.
Well, in Europe, Nathan, Britain's unemployment rate rose unexpectedly to a 6-month high. We get more from UK economic correspondent Lizzie Burden.
Unemployment was expected to tick up. Actually, it went from 3.9% to 4.2% rather than just 4%. But on the other hand, you had average weekly earnings expected to tick down from 6.1% to 5.8%. Actually, they only went to 6%, so hotter than expected. So it's mixed signals here from the labour market data.
Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden says the labor numbers come ahead of tomorrow's March reading on consumer prices.
We got some new economic data out of Asia, Karen. China's economic growth beat expectations in the first quarter as factory output led the expansion. Bloomberg Daybreak Asia anchor Brian Curtis has more from Hong Kong.
GDP rose 5.3% year on year. That's higher than the estimate of 4.8%. In March, industrial production was up 4.5% from a year earlier versus a forecast of 6%. Retail sales rose 3.1%, missing an estimate of 4.8%. China's recovery has been out of balance. Manufacturing holding up, but the property crisis is denting both household and business confidence. In Hong Kong, Brian Curtis, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Brian, thank you. And it's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's John Tucker. John, good morning.
And good morning, Karen. New York finally has a budget deal. It exceeds $233 billion. And sources say it includes the most sweeping change in housing policy in years. Details in this report from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
Those sources say the tentative spending plan includes a tax break for affordable housing construction alongside new restrictions on evictions and rent increases for market-rate renters. Details of the budget, which was originally due April 1st, are subject to change before final approval. Soaring rents and upcoming elections are key factors driving state lawmakers to forge an agreement with Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul a year after she failed to advance a proposal aimed at building 800,000 new homes over a decade. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
House Republicans will walk the articles of impeachment against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas over to the Senate today. It kicks off a trial in that chamber. Republicans accuse Mayorkas of mishandling the crisis at the southern border. Vice President Harris returning to the campaign trail to underscore the stakes of the election. The vice president speaking in Las Vegas a week after the Arizona Supreme Court upheld an abortion ban from 1864.
What we are seeing in these states that we are talking about are Trump abortion bans, and he can't get away from that.
In the wake of the Arizona Supreme Court decision, now California is bracing for an influx of women seeking abortion. The Supreme Court will weigh the legality of charges brought against hundreds of people in connection with the attack on the U.S. Capitol. The question for the justices is whether a law passed as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley financial reforms can be read to cover the January 6th riot. Hundreds of people, including Donald Trump, have been charged with obstructing an official proceeding. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker. This is Bloomberg. Nathan and Karen.
All right, John, thank you. And it's time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update with John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. A terrific regular season for the Rangers right from the start. They won 18 of their first 23 games. It ended at the Garden with a 4-0 shutout of Ottawa, and the Rangers finished with a club record 114 points. That's the most in the NHL. Their first-round opponent could still be one of 4 different teams. Washington and Detroit have 89 points. Pittsburgh has 88. Philadelphia 87 with 1 game left. Islanders are in the playoffs. 5th time in the last 6 years. They finished 7-1 down the stretch, beat the Devils 4-1. The Islanders will face Carolina in round one. Bruins failed to clinch their division, lost 2-0 in Washington. The Mets, who began the season 0-5, are now 8-8 to come from behind 6-3 win over the Pirates at Citi Field. The Mets allowed only 3 hits. Yankees had only 4, so did the Blue Jays, but Toronto won 3-1. Chris Bassett beat Luis Gil, the Yanks' first 2-game losing streak of the season. The big Yankee news: the retirement effective immediately of John Sterling, the radio voice of the Yanks the last 36 years. He's 85. Says he's tired. He'll be honored at the stadium on Saturday. In Brooklyn, they held the WNBA draft. Has there ever been any draft with less suspense over who the first pick will be? Caitlin Clark headed to the Indiana Fever.
All this has come with just the person that I am and the player that I've been able to be, and that's exactly how I want to go into the WNBA. Is don't change anything that I've done. Obviously, learn, adapt, find ways to get better. People are going to expose my weaknesses, but that's the amazing thing about it. That's the challenge that I wanted.
The WNBA announced not only is San Francisco getting the team next season, they hope to add 3 more expansion teams by 2028. Off-season workouts for the Giants, and Daniel Jones says he'll be ready for the start of training camp back to the torn ACL. He also says he's not concerned that the Giants might draft a quarterback 2 weeks from Thursday. Giants have the 6th pick. John Stashauer, Bloomberg Sports. Karen, Nathan.
All right, John, thank you. S&P futures, little change now. So are NASDAQ futures. Dow futures down 0.1% or 40 points. And the 10-year Treasury yield is at 4.64%.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. The world is waiting for Israel's response to Iran's weekend drone and missile attack, even as allies ramp up their calls for restraint and avoiding the kind of tit-for-tat response that could spiral into a wider conflict in the Middle East. For more, Bloomberg Israel Bureau Chief Ethan Bronner is back with us from Tel Aviv. Ethan, good morning. We're hearing Israeli military officials say they have no choice but to respond. What is the appetite in Israel for a counterattack?
It's a bit diffuse. I mean, they actually published a poll on one of the TV channels this morning showing that it's about a third, meaning do it right now, do it later, don't do it. So it's not like there's some overwhelming public pressure for a response. I think that a lot of Israelis were grateful for the cooperation the United States, UK, and France, and even some Arab neighbors gave in stopping that big attack on Saturday night. And they've kind of, been in the doghouse in terms of how the world has seen them because of their war in Gaza. And I think that has been satisfying to be embraced again and to see the coalition as the way forward. But, at the same time, they do worry. This was the first time that Iran has ever shot from its own soil at Israel, and the sense that if you don't respond, that somehow you're telling them you're weak. So that's kind of the debate that's going on all day, all night here, and I don't know how it's going to sort itself out.
Now, of course, the debate that allies are trying to add to this is that cooler heads should prevail. We've heard from the White House saying that Netanyahu should, quote, take the win.
Take the win.
How much is that playing into this?
Well, I think it is playing into it. I mean, I don't think it's unimportant. I think that, as I say, that the sense that the United States is back again, embracing Israel and sharing in its defense needs and so on is important to people. It's the most important alliance that this country has. But, there's this kind of old debate here, which is, do we want to be loved by our friends or feared by our enemies? If we have to choose, we'll choose feared by our enemies. Now, the remaining question is hitting back the best way to be feared? And I think that's part of the debate, too.
Interesting. We've also heard from Israeli military officials who've spoken to Bloomberg Radio saying that they've presented a number of options to the war cabinet. What could a potential Israeli response look like at this point?
Well, I mean, there are all of this range of options, right, from doing nothing to, shall we say, some kind of a quote-unquote soft attack, like a cyber attack, then maybe a hit upon a military facility somewhere, or hit upon facilities belonging to proxies in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq. Those are, and then of course, an assassination of some kind, or indeed some kind of attack on their nuclear facilities, which seems rather exceptionally unlikely. But those are the ranges. So, and all that's being debated.
And the U.S. has said that it won't support Israel when it comes to a direct counterattack. Among those options, is there a sense within the war cabinet that there are options that the U.S. and its allies would get behind?
There probably is, but they haven't shared it with me, and I've been trying to find out. My sense is that they do want to not cross the U.S. in what they do. They want it to be seen as something that the U.S. can accept and permit. And so that's where they're going through that. I think, if there were a cyber attack, if there were an attack on proxies or something, I'm assuming that the Americans would not necessarily say absolutely no way. But I don't know. Those are debates that are going on at a very high level. And I think that there's probably a great deal of uncertainty in the U.S. administration and in the Israeli government about what should or what could happen.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, SiriusXM, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.